Ahead and start then. Wonderful. Hey everyone. Thank you guys all for joining. My name is Meher Sethi. I'm a junior at Waubonsie Valley. I hope you guys are all doing well. I know this is a stressful time for everybody, but we are so excited to have put this webinar together. It's been a while in the making. I want to give a quick shout out to Nate Sapel and our entire executive board. It's been a phenomenal process. So thank you so much. And also, now that I have the platform, shout out to all the frontline essential workers. You guys are doing an amazing job. We salute you. I just wanted to share something really quick. I recently saw an article that had a survey in it, which, paraphrased, noted that the way a majority of our generation, being young people, views the climate crisis is with the same amount of urgency as we view the COVID-19 crisis. And it got me thinking about all sorts of intersections between what's been happening and this other capital E existential threat, the climate crisis. Like, has pollution potentially contributed to the spread of the virus? Or can pollution maybe cause other public health issues? You know, as a result of lockdowns globally, fossil fuel emissions have reduced drastically. It's really interesting. And it's made me realize we need to keep talking about climate change. We can't let it escape our radar because it's just too important. So in the spirit of Earth Week, and actually the 50th anniversary of Earth Week 2, let's keep fighting. We've seen what can happen when we're all working together to combat a crisis. So I want to give a really quick overview of what exactly is going to come in this summit. Please stay tuned because at 2 p.m., we're so incredibly excited to have distinguished guests, Congresswoman Lauren Underwood, Congressman Sean Casten, Congressman Bill Foster, and environmental activist Jeff Gahris with us for an incredibly insightful panel discussion. But I'm soon going to hand it off to the Climate Reality Project, an organization founded by former Vice President Al Gore, for a quick presentation by Bella Hubbard and Effi Jacobsen. They've both done a lot of activist work in the climate sphere, and they're both seniors at Evanston Township, which is an awesome perspective to have for us young people. So I would say for now, just grab a cup of coffee, get some snacks, and let's enjoy a nice conversation. Bella, Effie, take it away.
All right, I'm just gonna share my screen really quick, and we're ready to go. All right. How's it looking? Can everybody see? It's loading. Okay. Are we good? Yeah, I think we're good. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Bella Hubbard.
And I'm Effi Jacobsen, and as he said, we're seniors at Evanston Township High School and a part of the Sunrise Movement and Climate Reality Project. And this presentation is kind of a combination of resources from both of these organizations.
We have both become super involved in climate activism within the last year, and I can say personally that I have been scared about the climate crisis my entire life, and this has been such a life-changing and empowering experience to get involved with this work and has really carried us forward together. So this is actually a picture of Effie and I and our Girl Scout troop 10 years ago, and this is relevant because 10 years from now, if we do not take immediate action, the climate crisis is looking to become irreversible. So just imagine 10 years from now, just for a second, and see where you might be. So after this presentation, these are our 3 main takeaways. We really hope that everyone has a deeper understanding of the climate crisis and its urgency. We want to make sure that we all understand that at its core, it's a justice issue, and we want to feel hopeful and motivated to act. So this is the setup of the presentation. Must we change? Can we change? Will we change? And the first part is sort of the darkest part, so bear with us. We promise things will get lighter.
So when we look up at the sky, it seems vast and limitless, but in reality, it's a very thin shell of atmosphere surrounding our planet. If you were to turn a car on its side and drive straight up, it would take less than 10 minutes to reach the edge. And into this fragile bubble, we're dumping 110 million tons of pollution every single day.
So here's a quick explanation of sort of how the greenhouse effect works. And you can see that Earth is actually the Goldilocks planet. And that's because it's not too hot, not too cold, but just right to sustain life. And that's because we have this layer of greenhouse gases that takes the sun's heat and traps some of it while letting some of it escape. But as we're thickening this layer of greenhouse gases, more and more of the sun's heat is being trapped into this atmosphere. And so we're seeing extreme heating. So here are some of the biggest contributors to these greenhouse gases. One that we're really going to be focusing on today, and kind of the biggest one, is these coal power plants. So that's where we're getting most of our energy today in the United States, by burning fossil fuels. Another huge one is industrial processes. So that's anything you're buying brand new from the store. Landfills. So every time that you are throwing your food into the landfill, it actually rots and produces methane, which is 25 times more potent than your everyday greenhouse gas. And another big one that we're just going to touch on today is agriculture. That's another huge producer of methane.
As we're seeing this huge increase in the amount of fossil fuels that we're burning in just the last 100 years, we're seeing the exact same pattern, which is a huge spike in global temperatures, which is never been seen before.
Mm-hmm. And so today, a third of the Earth's population is seeing this deadly heat waves, right? And we know that that's only predicted to worsen within our lifetime. Unfortunately, in my lifetime, if we do not combat the climate crisis, I'm looking to see 60 days a year in Chicago where it's too hot to go outside.
And this warming is happening all over the planet. Antarctica was recently 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And this warming is causing glaciers and ice caps to melt, which is causing sea levels to rise, and something called tidal flooding, which is when high sea levels cause entire coastal cities to be flooded in feet of water.
So something we're recently finding out is that most of this heat that we're producing is being absorbed by our oceans. And this is extremely dangerous because it's affecting our water cycle. So as you can see here, more water is evaporated with higher temperatures, and it stays in the atmosphere for much longer. And so when it finally does rain, we see these enormous rain bombs. And this is something we would have never seen even 50 years ago. And it's also causing more frequent, more intense, and longer lasting hurricanes. And normally when a hurricane reaches land, it tends to dissipate really quickly, but now with these high temperatures, they tend to actually get worse once they reach land, which is causing extreme damage all over the world.
And these storms often mobilize pollution, like this oil spill. And we know that companies intentionally place facilities like this in low-income communities and communities of color because they don't always have the resources to prevent it. So then toxic waste like this ends up in people's backyards.
And Hurricane Maria killed more people than 9/11. These are American people, and our government had the chance to protect so many of these lives. We know that if this
Bella, I think that audio is not quite coming through right now. Maybe Effie can just continue from here.
Okay. So I'm sure that many of you haven't heard of Cyclone Idai in Mozambique, but many of you have heard of the Notre Dame fire, and that actually received billions of dollars and a ton of support, while this killed 1,000 people and nobody heard about it. And this is also affecting our agriculture, which is a huge issue. Just this spring, we're going to see extreme flooding in Illinois, which is going to affect farmers' livelihoods and prices and food accessibility. How many of you heard that Chicago recently declared a climate emergency? I don't know if you've noticed at Lake Michigan, but our lakes are way higher than we've ever seen them before. And our group is actually working with the mayor of Evanston to declare a climate emergency ourselves. And unfortunately, we could show you slide after slide. Oh, are you back, Effie?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay.
So yeah, we could show you slide after slide of flooding and storms affecting people all over the planet.
So something that many of us don't know is extreme cold is also caused by the climate crisis. This is because the polar vortex, which is meant to be on the North and South Pole, has literally split in two. And it's reaching the United States and Europe, and it's causing these deadly cold winters where it's way too cold for anybody to live or breathe outside. And we know, again, the same story, people who don't have access to healthcare, who don't have access to heating systems are going to be most impacted and most vulnerable. So the same water that's being evaporated by our oceans and causing those storms and hurricanes is being evaporated by our land at an even faster rate.
We know that water scarcity already affects more than 40% of the world's population, and this number is increasing quickly. Just like flooding affects agriculture, drought affects agriculture, and we know that climate change is one of the leading causes of global hunger because of issues like this.
Mm-hmm. So this farmer lost his entire farm to a drought in Syria, and that actually happened to millions of other Syrians, causing them to have to move into urban areas, which caused extreme instability and war. And so many of us don't know that the Syrian refugee crisis and what's going on in Syria right now has a whole lot to do with climate change. And we actually know that the refugee crisis that we are going to see is the largest in history from the climate crisis. The same story in Honduras and El Salvador, where people have no choice but to leave everything they know behind and move upwards because their land is completely uninhabitable. And we know that a wall is not going to fight this crisis, but that climate policy really will.
Every branch of the United States government has acknowledged that the climate crisis is the largest threat to national security.
So we know that more droughts and higher temperatures obviously means more fires. And here's just a picture of Australia. We see that the continent is literally, well, it was in January, on fire. And that's not natural. Let's just have that be clear. We're also seeing this on the West Coast in the United States. And this is really the typical American response. You can see all of these guys just playing golf, and really it's the people who have the resources to ignore this crisis are doing so. And unfortunately, a lot of us are guilty of this climate neglect, right? It's sort of become our reality. We're just used to it.
The climate crisis is a health crisis. Everything we've talked about so far can have lifelong physical and mental impacts on people affected. And just one example of this is air pollution kills 9 million people every single year. New Delhi, India recently declared a state of emergency because their air quality is no longer safe to breathe. And there are lots of statistics that show that this is also a justice issue, one being that Black children are 10 times more likely to die of asthma than white children.
So here's actually an image of Chicago, which is our area, is guilty of environmental racism. And so we can see the most environmentally burdened areas are in the South and West Side, which are predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods. And we know that this is because industries are purposely placing their coal-fired power plants, their waste transfer stations, all kinds of toxic facilities in these areas where people don't have the money or the resources to demand that they leave. And so the COVID-19 crisis and the climate crisis are really shedding a light on the deep inequities of this country. This is of Hurricane Katrina, which was a while ago, but still a huge effect of the climate crisis. And here's today, and we see that 70% of people affected by COVID-19 who have been killed, who have died of COVID-19 in Chicago were Black, when Chicago only makes up 30% of the population of Chicago. And it's that same map, as you can see, these two areas, the South and West Side, very similar maps.
And one super recent example of both of these issues is a coal plant that was recently demolished in Chicago just a few weeks ago. In Little Village, which we know is a predominantly Latinx neighborhood, a huge dust cloud was over the community for several days in the middle of a respiratory pandemic. And on a more global scale, we're seeing a huge mass extinction. We're at risk of losing up to 50% of all land-based species by the end of this century.
And the worst part of all is that Exxon has known about this crisis. Exxon and many other huge corporations like this. They've been doing research about this since the 70s and have since been paying our politicians to stay silent about this issue. So a huge part of this movement right now is to really get those politicians who are taking fossil fuel money and prioritizing that to begin to prioritize people over profit, or we will vote them out. So that was the dark part, and we just want everyone to sort of take a minute to feel their feelings and maybe write them down in the chat. Okay, so must we change? And normally we would have a huge audience of people saying, yes! But the question is, can we change? And again, the answer is yes. The climate crisis, the solutions to this crisis are already here. Greta and thousands of other scientists will tell us this. We just need the policy to implement them.
And just one example is wind power. We know that this has the capacity to meet our global energy needs 40 times over. And we are seeing a huge increase in the amount that's being used as it becomes more accessible.
An even better looking story with the solar industry. These jobs are booming. And if you're looking at a career right now, you're a young person and you're trying to decide what you want to do, just know that there's so many different paths to take and so many different aspects of this movement that you can contribute to. So here's the same spike that we're seeing. But unfortunately, still, our government is subsidizing the fossil fuels. And that's because many politicians have agreements with these huge fossil fuel corporations where they give them the money and they give them subsidies. So we really need to change this. We need subsidies in renewables to see a good, bright future.
There are also some things we can do on a more individual scale. So Project Drawdown lists solutions to the climate crisis in order of effectiveness. And you see that number 3 is reduced food waste. 40% of the food that we produce in the United States goes to waste, which, like Bella says, ends up producing methane. And number 4 is a plant-rich diet. And we're not saying you have to be vegetarian, but making little changes like that in your life can have a super big impact.
Effie, can you talk a little closer to the mic? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Bella?
I'm here. Oh, sorry. Another huge part of this is that we're going to need to be seeing a huge change and shift in our agriculture. So renewable agriculture is really the future. And shout out to Italy. Oh, this is bad. For implementing a climate curriculum for all students so that everybody's really educated on this crisis. And Indigenous people are really taking the lead in this movement as they have been for hundreds of years, especially in the Amazon we're seeing, which produces 20% of Earth's oxygen. So will we change? And this is really when it comes to you guys.
So in 2015, leaders from almost every country in the world came together and agreed that we are facing a climate crisis, and they agreed to work together to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And in 2016, Trump tried to take us out of this agreement, but we know that he can't do this until the day after the 2020 election, which brings us to one of our action points, which is be politically active and vote. Make sure that you're voting for people with strong climate policy in the presidential election and in every local election happening around you. So on the topic of climate politics, the Green New Deal is very relevant right now, so I'm just going to read this little explanation of it. The Green New Deal is a congressional resolution for the United States to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources and become net zero emissions and create millions of clean, high-paying jobs in the process, while prioritizing frontline and marginalized communities in every step.
So this is Sunrise's explanation of how the Green New Deal and the Corona crisis and the climate crisis sort of all align. And I'm just going to read it out because I think it's so powerful. So right now we are in a crisis. As this pandemic sweeps our country, thousands and thousands of people are getting sick and losing their jobs. Our economy is spiraling and our government's leaders are failing to respond on the scale we need. But we've come out of crises like these before. In the 1920s, just years after the Spanish flu swept the nation, in the midst of a depression, people rallied around a vision for a better future, the New Deal. Now, as climate change bears down upon us and we face unprecedented economic and social instability, it's time to do it again. The case has never been clearer for a Green New Deal. This is a moment in history that offers us the chance to return to better rather than to normal. Let's all take advantage of this time in quarantine where we have so much time on our hands to grow this movement as much as we possibly can so that when this is all over, we can take to the streets and demand a better future from our politicians. So in 1961, Kennedy said, let's go to the moon. And just 8 years later, we made it to the moon. This is this level of mass mobilization that we need in order to make it. But we know that it's possible. We've seen huge changes like this in history so many times before. It requires every single one of us to join this movement and to do everything we possibly can. So this really just speaks to the fact that whatever negative feelings you have come out from this presentation, action is the cure. I promise you that it is so hard to go on ignoring or forgetting about the climate crisis. But when you take action, it is the most empowering and life-changing experience. And it feels so, so gratifying and good to take action.
So studies of social movements in the past have shown that every movement to mobilize 3.5% of the population has been successful in achieving the cultural and political shift that they were looking for. So that's kind of another one of our #1 action points, which is being part of that mobilization, which, like she said, means being aware and being active. So this is just, we're gonna show you a couple of the things that our group has done. This is a die-in at the Trump Tower from October of last year.
This was our September 20th global climate strike, which we worked super hard to organize, and over 500 kids walked out of school and were met by a ton of community members and families. It was a super powerful day.
And then this is a chalk out we did. Over 100 students went to the downtown Evanston with sidewalk chalk and wrote messages all over the sidewalks and buildings just to kind of spread awareness and
And we also were at the Chicago Women's March leading the Climate Justice Block. Another big thing that our group took part of that was really run by Northwestern's divestment team was Northwestern Divestment Day, where students stood in front of the school demanding that Northwestern divest because Northwestern is currently invested $50 million in the fossil fuel industry. And many large institutions are also invested in fossil fuels. And we need to change that. We need to demand that people and companies are divesting. And this was our Earth Day. We made these signs and put them up all over town. It was really fun. And although we couldn't mobilize in the streets the way we had hoped to, this was still a really powerful way to grow our movement. So as a local hub, we've seen huge successes. Our group has grown from 8 to over 50 students. We've gotten our school to hire a sustainability coordinator, and we've been meeting with our mayor and pushing Evanston to declare a climate emergency. These are just a few of our successes. So these are our 4 main goals within our school, and I think that they're really great for any students who are trying to change policy in their school. So we really want a climate curriculum, a zero waste program, a transition to renewable energy, and a cultural shift where everybody really understands the gravity of this crisis and what it really means.
And then another one of the most important things to do as individuals is to be talking about the climate crisis, because people kind of tend to ignore it and not want to talk about it. But if we're not talking about it, then the press won't cover it and politicians won't prioritize it.
So it is a privilege to not be affected by the climate crisis yet, and a responsibility to act for those who are already being impacted and will shortly be impacted. Here are just a few things that we hope that you can use. These are amazing resources. I really, really recommend everyone go to Sunrise School. You learn so much, and it's just like the best way to become a part of this movement. Look this up. Just look up Sunrise School, Sunrise Movement, and join this class. And then I also recommend that everybody watch A Message from the Future with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. That's a really powerful video. And then you can follow us on Instagram, and you can follow the Sunrise Movement as well on Instagram. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Sorry for the little tweaks, but thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. That was wonderful. And real quick, looks like we have Representative Lauren Underwood locked in. I want to welcome her to this. This is going to be great as we start to transition over to our panel discussion. But real quick, while we have a couple minutes left until 2 o'clock, I want to ask a couple of the questions that were actually sent in through the RSVPs. So first of all, you guys touched on curriculum education when it comes to climate science. Do you think that teaching environmental science in this manner should be mandatory in our education process?
We think that the United States should follow the lead of Italy, which made required minimum hours of climate curriculum every year. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the format of science because it really applies to almost all subjects, but we do think that every student should receive fundamental climate education.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Next question. You guys talked about food waste and how much it contributes to climate change. Obviously, it's a very substantial contributor. Do you think that combating it can be very, very effective when it comes to the climate crisis? And is it possible?
Yeah, like we said, it's ranks number 3 on the list of most effective solutions to reverse climate change. And I think it said 40% of food in the United States goes to waste. So that's definitely a big thing that needs to change soon.
Mm-hmm.
Bella, do you want to follow up, or did she get it?
Yeah, I think she got it. I think that's like one of those individual actions where everybody can be composting and working to avoid their food waste. But as a group, I think that we really try to focus on policy, just because at the point where we are in this crisis, even if everybody changed their behavior, we would still be facing the climate crisis. So we really need like huge global scale policy change as well. Mm-hmm.
True, absolutely. Now, we know that over the course of this pandemic, there's obviously been a significant drop in transportation and overall in fossil fuel emissions. But the question is, do you think that this gives us a little bit of breathing room now to start to fight climate change, or is it just as urgent?
Speaking to that, I don't think that it gives.
Is the audio coming through for others?
Yeah, Bella, try again.
Okay.
Okay, I can take that one.
Okay.
You take it. You take
Okay.
it.
Wait, you're back now, though.
Oh, okay. So sorry. I would just say we should take advantage of this time. I don't think that the amount of reduced emissions right now are going to give us like more time to combat the climate crisis. But we should definitely, this is an opportunity that we've never seen before where we're all in our houses. So let's definitely expand this movement. But no, it's not sustainable for us to expect that this pandemic is going to like give us more time to fight the climate crisis.
Cool. Yeah. And last question, what are the best ways for young people, for high schoolers, for college students to get involved in the fight for climate action?
I would say, first of all, join Sunrise School. That's like step one. Then step two, make your own hub, because it's like really DIY, really easy. And start showing up to stuff. Like once you really get like, once you start realizing like there's events going on all the time. Right now, since we're all quarantined, I would really recommend joining Sunrise School and telling everybody you know to also join Sunrise School so that when this is over, we can grow our movement as much as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We're now getting over to the time when we're going to transition to our panel discussion. So I really appreciate your coming on and contributing to this summit. Yeah, thank you so much. Everyone give a round of applause at home for Bella and Effi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
All right, cool. Welcome, Representative Foster. I see that you've just logged in. I think we're waiting on right now. Just looks like Representative Casten should be joining us soon. And then Mr. Gahris, I think your video is off right now. You should be good to join back in. There we go. Wonderful. Okay, cool. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much to Bella and Effi, of course, for their insight. That was a wonderful presentation. For anyone who may have just joined, my name is Meher Sethi. I'm a junior at Waubonsie Valley and a fervent advocate of climate action. And I'm incredibly excited that we're about to start our panel discussion with Representatives Lauren Underwood, Sean Casten, Representative Foster, as well as environmental activist Mr. Jeff Gahris. So to quickly preface, most of the questions we will be discussing are derived from what you guys all submitted through the RSVP forms, but obviously there is a Q&A chat function. So, you know, if we have time, if time permits, that should allow us to make this pretty lively and interactive. So I think to start off, how about we just go in that order? So we can start with Representative Underwood and then go to Representative Foster and then Mr. Gahris. Just giving a quick background for people who may not be 100% familiar and just some quick introductions.
Okay, hi everybody. Hi Meher. It's so good to see you again. I'm really glad to be on with you this afternoon. I have the great honor of representing a community in Northern Illinois. I was just elected in November of 2018. My district stretches from Shorewood and Minooka all the way to the Wisconsin border. Six Flags is in our district and we go out west to Northern Illinois University in Chicago. We don't have campus, we stop right at that campus line. And, you know, I'm a nurse and I think that we have a lot to do to protect people's health and stop climate change. So I'm really glad to be part of this conversation today. Happy Earth Day, everybody.
All right, I'm on. Yeah, sure. Well, I'm Congressman Bill Foster, and I sometimes introduce myself as saying I represent 100% of the strategic reserve of physicists in the United States Congress. Before entering Congress, I worked at Fermi National Labs for almost 25 years. I was on the team that discovered the top quark, the heaviest known form of matter. And I'm also actually a businessman. Back when I was 19, my little brother and I started a company that now makes most of the theater lighting equipment in the United States. So if you've ever been to Disneyland or Disney World and seen the Main Street Electrical Parade, I designed and programmed that, you know, back when I was, geez, about 25, I guess. But I serve along with Representative Casten, who has magically appeared here. We both serve on the Science Committee, which, you know, has been for many years a real struggle and has been massively improved by all the newly elected members of the last term. I think if you Google my name and the word Greenland, so if you Google Bill Foster Greenland, you're led to a story and a video that shows where one of the Republican witnesses was trying to convince us that it was a matter of scientific debate whether or not it was a good thing if the Greenland ice sheet melted. And so this is a sort of climate denial that we've been having to deal with for years, but it's changing. And one of the really, really important good signs, even prior to the COVID crisis, was that it seemed as though the fever may have broken on the other side of the aisle. That many members of Congress who had been hardcore climate deniers have now gone, they go back home, they talk to their farmers, and the farmers say, look, something is changing. And that's really made a difference. Just before Christmas, a group of the Republicans on the Science Committee came up with a proposal to double scientific research. And this is just a sea change from past behavior, and something that I think Democrats are going to be working hard to enthusiastically say yes to. Because I think ultimately it's only through research that we're going to understand this problem and how quickly we have to react to it, and the technological solutions to it. And so happy to be here, and I guess I'll turn it over to Sean.
Hey, thank you. Sorry for not being here right at the start. I was actually here listening, but I think I had the Zoom link as a viewer and had to chase down the one as a participant.
Absolutely okay.
Thank you so much for doing this. Happy Earth Day to everybody. Like Lauren, I am a brand new member of Congress. Like Lauren, I've run for one elected office in my entire life, and that was this most recent last election. But what I spent the prior 20 years doing is trying to do something about climate change. I'm kind of a one-trick pony in that regard. I did my master's thesis in biochemical engineering, trying to figure out how to make cellulosic biofuels, with the idea that if we could make renewable fuels that didn't depend on corn and sort of the food fuel nexus, that would be a path to sustainability. I then spent a couple of years working as a chemical engineer in the consulting space, working on fuel cells and batteries and microturbines and electric vehicles, and basically became convinced that there are so many technologies that are totally proven, the patents have totally expired, and they are totally underdeployed, that this wasn't really a science problem. It's a deployment problem, and we have talked about climate change the wrong way. And so that led me to create two different companies, the first one in 2000, the second one in 2007, that brought me out to Illinois. But they both had missions to profitably reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we set out to do it with completely proven technologies. So I built about 80 projects, deployed a couple $100 million worth of capital. Not a single one of them had a patent that hadn't expired at least 30 years before we used it. And not a single one of them was less than twice as fuel efficient as the US electric grid. In fact, Thomas Edison's first power plant that he ever built was about twice as efficient as the electric plant grid is today. That tells you almost everything you need to know about both the problem and how we're talking about it the wrong way. Because if you can run your economy more efficiently, that means that you can save money and reduce CO2. And in fact, there are countries like Switzerland, like Germany, like Denmark, like Japan, that use half as much energy as we do per dollar GDP. That is astounding. It is massively depressing, but it also means that we have an unbelievable opportunity to essentially rip off the Band-Aid and become both wealthier and cleaner. And most of the ways we've talked about climate in the past have been dead wrong, because we framed this as, how do I possibly allocate the pain of this transition? And in fact, we have a much different but equally difficult problem, which is, how do we allocate the gain of this transition? When the price of energy is falling faster than the cost to build new generation assets, we are running towards a point where there is not going to be an incentive to invest or to turn off your lights when you leave the room, because we keep building these generation assets that have this annoying feature that they have no marginal operating cost. That's a problem. It's a good problem, but it's a problem. And we've been focusing on the wrong thing for 30 years. And so I now serve, as Congressman Foster mentioned, on the Science Committee. I serve on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis that Speaker Pelosi created. And I serve on the Financial Services Committee, which may seem like an outlier, but basically I think it's really important to understand that if you understand the science of climate, then the first conclusion you come to is we're not going to fix it unless we fundamentally change our energy policy. And if you understand the needs of what we have to do in the scope of the energy policy change, you better understand capital markets. And one of the things that I find is challenging everywhere, but particularly in Washington, is that if you're a really passionate environmentalist, you probably didn't spend a lot of time in the energy industry. And you probably didn't spend a lot of time in capital markets. If you've spent a ton of time in the energy industry and a ton of time in capital markets, you might not be the world's greatest environmentalist. And you need all of those pieces of expertise to get through. And you know, like I said, I've done that for 20 years in the private space, and now we're trying to make sure that we can try to do what we can legislatively, because we are darn near out of time. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And then we'll turn it over to Mr. Gahris.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, particularly with this great panel of members of Congress. So it's an honor. And I was just dropped by the internet. Hopefully I can stay on. But I do want to explain a little bit about who I am. I participated in the very second Earth Day when I was in high school. So my hat's off to high school students who are engaged, because this could lead to a whole lifetime of involvement. So I think that's important to be engaged at a younger age, and even as you go into school. And so I ended up getting an engineering degree, but I also became an environmental scientist by getting a master's degree in Ohio. And then my wife and I ended up here because I had a job with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So I was involved mainly with air pollution control. But I've done a lot of things in terms of their career, from international level all the way down to local, and some of it's been volunteer work. I've been having a lot of fun working with like an environmental commission for the Village of Glen Ellen, or the Sierra Club, or the Citizens Climate Lobby, other groups. I tend to be involved with multiple groups, and I think there's just a lot of answers to bring to the table, and I like exploring all those possibilities. I think the Sierra Club has been a particularly rich experience because it involves people with different points of view, different issues, and I started thinking about what an environmentalist is, and I was just off of a call like this with Catherine Hayhoe, who is internationally renowned environmental activist, a climate scientist, and she was explaining how we are all environmentalists because we live on the planet Earth, and we are humans, and we rely on the planet to survive. It is our home. And so that makes us automatically all environmentalists. And I thought that was a very powerful message. And so I'm learning all the time about climate communication. So that's going to be my remarks today, will be kind of focused on that. How do we communicate to others? And I'm even now running for the Forest Preserve District. It's a very local race here in DuPage County. And it involves, you know, a political activity. You know, you run for office and you have to convince people to vote for you, but you have to have a message. And my message would be about the environment. So that's where I'm at today. So thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah, appreciate it. I think we're going to start off now with our first question. As I mentioned, these are through some of the RSVP submissions that we've gotten. So this is, you know, first going to be pitched to everybody. You know, domestically, we contribute a lot to climate change. But as we've approached COVID-19, it's been sort of a global effort. Now, other countries also contribute a lot to the climate crisis. So how do we approach this issue as a global effort? Perhaps Representative Casten, do you want to start us off, or somebody else?
Well, let me give you a little bit of hope, because you're right. Like, COVID has been all-consuming, and we finished our report on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis that was supposed to be setting our agenda. That was supposed to be released in March, and we're now sort of in indefinite suspension because it's going to be like a tree falling in the forest when no one's around if we release it right now. But the hope I'd give you is that what we are gaining in this moment, which is long overdue, is a respect for science and a respect for scientists. And we are also gaining respect for the fact that when you have geometrically compounding problems that are caused by something invisible that you can't see or taste or feel, and the solution to it requires mass public action, Am I talking about COVID or am I talking about climate change? And we're coming to an appreciation of what that means. And I think there's a fundamental change in what people are realizing or sort of commonality as a species and our needs to act together. And I'm not saying we should rest easy on it, but the rise in the respect for scientists and the rise in the understanding that some things are more complicated. And I hope the rise in the idea that, you know, if your mechanic told you that you didn't have cancer and your doctor was an idiot, you'd probably get a new mechanic because you'd think this is not someone who has any expertise in this area. And I think we're starting to get a recognition that when a politician tells you that the climate scientists are full of beans, they deserve just as much respect as that bogus mechanic.
Absolutely. Rep Foster or Rep Underwood, do you want to follow up with that?
Well, sure. Maybe I'll say just something about the international aspect of it. You know, that we're seeing that if there is hope in the COVID crisis, it's going to be the international scientific community coming together. And it's really breathtaking to see, you know, all of the scientists from all over the world just instantly publishing the results that they'd normally be holding tight to themselves so that they could personally profit on this. And they're just saying, nope, you know, the world is at stake. And just, you know, publishing, you know, everything that they think they have discovered scientifically and having it discussed scientifically. And that's, you know, one of the reasons why I'm hopeful that maybe things like a vaccine may not be 18 months away, but maybe faster than that. And there are a number of things that I hope that we're learning here. And we're also seeing learning by bad example. If all that you do is trash talk other countries, you accomplish almost nothing in this. And that we also are starting to understand the link between economic development and economic equality and making a better world. Because, you know, they're going to see the largest damage from COVID-19 is going to be in the developing world, where they're not able to defend themselves and their communities as well. And we're seeing a lot of the difficult to eliminate carbon emissions going to be coming from coming from the developing world. And we have to show them a path towards development that doesn't involve the sort of carbon emissions that we had. You know, they're just breathtaking pictures of New Delhi and cities in China where you can actually see the skyline. And it's just, if you ever visited them, it's difficult to exist without a mask in those cities under normal circumstances. And now at least they have seen what the future could look like with more attention paid to pollution.
Absolutely. Perhaps Congresswoman Underwood or Mr. Gahris?
Well, I'd just like to remind everybody about the Paris Climate Agreement. In 2015, the United States, along with 200 nations around the world, signed an agreement to set some real ambitious goals around reducing carbon emissions. In 2017, President Trump removed the United States, and we're one of a very small handful of countries that are no longer participating in this agreement. And last year, the House Democrats, the United States Congress, passed the Climate Action Now Act, which recommits the United States to that agreement. It's a really important bill that is currently sitting with Mitch McConnell in the Senate. And, you know, I think we have to continue to hold the Republicans in the Senate to look at really common sense legislation like this that would make a huge difference in our ability to fight back against climate change, make a huge difference in our ability to support other countries that have, you know, far fewer resources than we do, in having their backs in this type of really important agreement. And so I think that there's still an opportunity through the end of the year to get some traction in the Senate for this legislation. We know that climate change is a very, very, very important issue in this election. The arrival of COVID-19 doesn't boot climate change off the agenda for November. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of senators, and particularly, these Republican senators in these seats that are very competitive, these seats where they are not, their poll numbers are sliding, they're not rising, and they're going to be looking for items to, make their constituents understand that they're on the right side of history here. And it seems to me like the Paris Climate Agreement would be a good way to go if I was one of these vulnerable Republicans. So I think that with some advocacy, we could see that have a resurgence on the agenda come the fall. But if we blow it off and act like, we're going to have to just get a new president to make this happen, we're not going to have any hope of seeing the Paris Climate Agreement get implemented in 2020.
Sure. Mr. Gahris, you want to? I think you're on mute, so the audio is not coming through.
There we go. Thank you. Yeah, I think, just watching what's happening with the response to the pandemic and watching how we suddenly realize we're vulnerable. Our economic system is vulnerable. I think that was a lesson learned. And I think it goes all the way down to the local levels. And so we have to think about our local economy as well as what's happening internationally. And it's all intertwined. And we're all interconnected in ways we never realized. And I think that's going to wake people up and should translate into political action, I think, in terms of at least we're talking our values. We're talking about what we might lose. We talk about what the possibilities are. We can press some reset buttons with the local, national, international economies and relationships and bring science to bear. And there's a lot of solutions out there. But it's difficult in this sense because there's so many solutions. There's so many new technologies that could disrupt the marketplace. And so we have that uncertainty about where we're going. But but we just keep talking about it and keep looking at solutions that with a focus on people, our neighbors, our loved ones, what's going on in the community, I think we'll be moving into a better place and be a stronger country.
Right, yeah, just like we are with COVID. I think this next question is geared towards our members of Congress. How has the climate emergency specifically manifested in your respective districts? And what measures have you taken to sort of guide your district through the climate crisis? We can start with Representative Underwood.
Okay, so I'd say we see it in a couple ways. One is just the extreme flooding, particularly our community in Lake County, and they've just been hit hard. So many of our farmers have been, really devastated by the extreme rain. Last spring, it rained every single day in the spring, and so farmers weren't able to plant their crops. We've seen a significant economic impact of climate change already in the Illinois 14th Congressional District. The flooding has caused millions of dollars of damages to businesses, to homes, to farms, and to our infrastructure in our district. And on the rural piece, the farmers are actually some of our, really ardent supporters of climate change advancements because it has hit their bottom line so aggressively. So throughout the country, there's a new coalition. It's called Farmers for a Sustainable Future. And they are doing some work with the Illinois Farm Bureau in order to advance this conversation, and they want to be part of the solution. And while they might not all use words like climate change or climate action, they have different words that have the same meaning behind it. And more importantly, they're willing to act. So sometimes you just have to meet folks where they are. And as you all know, right, many of us are coming from different communities where literally the words we use matter. And so I'm really pleased to be able to have our farmers as a partner in this fight. And so both our Agriculture Advisory Committee and our Science Advisory Committee help us shape the activities that we do around the 14th Congressional District.
Wonderful. Congressman Foster, if you want to follow up with that.
Oh, sure. Well, Well, I think my district actually has the second, third, and fourth largest cities of Illinois in the form of Aurora, Joliet, and Naperville. And in Joliet, Joliet and nearby Romeoville, we've seen the closure of 3 coal plants. And it was interesting to see the reaction because, you know, those people who lost their jobs, there were hundreds of jobs lost, but yet people understood that the change had to come. And it was interesting to see how the whole community accepted it. And the reaction to it was to embrace solar installations throughout the area. And so I was very worried about that. It came at a good time in the economy so that the people who were laid off were able to, you know, go into different jobs. And we're left with a big residual problem with the coal ash ponds, which is a huge problem nationwide. There are multiple really nasty coal ash ponds. It's something I would guess we're leaving to your generation, but we're trying to find beneficial uses for that coal ash. There are ways to turn it into cement and other products and use it in roadways in ways that don't harm the environment. And so, you know, there'll be a lot of projects like that. And I think that people understand, even though there's some short-term pain in the economy, that this is a transition that has to take place.
So I think Congresswoman Underwood and Congressman Foster were, I think, very eloquent about the impacts of climate change. So I want to talk a little bit about public perception. One of the things that I am most proud of in my brief tenure in office was that by coincidence, Lucy McBath represents the suburbs of Atlanta. It's a very similar district, more affluent than average, more educated than average, whiter than average.
Hey, she's a Joliet girl. She grew up in Joliet.
Yes, and is a lovely person. But we both pulled our districts about the same time. And some of you may know Lucy's story. Her son was shot to death, and she became very active in the gun violence movement. And now holds the seat that used to be held by Newt Gingrich. We polled our districts at about the same time, very similar districts. And in the 6th district, the top 3 issues in order, this was about 6 months ago, were healthcare, climate change, and jobs in the economy. And in Lucy's district, the top 3 issues in order were healthcare, gun violence, jobs in the economy. And I mention that because I think we spend a lot of time saying, what will it take for public will to move? And the answer is that we all have the capability to lead. And if you're sitting around waiting for public will to tell you what to do, whatever you are, you ain't leading. And you know, we managed to get, because not because that was a top issue in the district, but because I've been out there talking about it through the whole campaign, got that, you know, for the campaign, and now is, you know, in office, of getting that to be the second most important issue to people. And what I really can't stress enough to all you young folks on the phone is to think about how to talk about that. One of the best pieces of advice that I ever got in communication was when we were trying to raise about $80 million on Wall Street to build a project. And I'm an engineer by training. When people ask me to do something that violates the second law of thermodynamics, I get annoyed and I start explaining the second law of thermodynamics to them. Which really goes over well with someone who's an English major. And the investment banker who we had, who was sort of coaching me on how to do a better job on this raise, said, when Americans go to France and they say, where's the bathroom? And the Frenchman says, no parle anglais. And the American says, I said, where's the bathroom? It's not super effective. And she said, when you go to a banker and they ask you a question in banker, and you answer an engineer louder, that's not really helpful. And I mention that with respect to climate change because with one exception of the 80 clean energy projects that I've built, there was only one of them that I sold to somebody who was primarily concerned about climate change. I sold a lot of projects to people who thought it was a big hoax, but they liked being rich. And so I basically said, look, I'm going to reduce your CO2 emissions, I'm going to save you money, and I'm going to keep 100% of the savings. They'd say, well, that's not fair. I want to get some of the savings. I'd say, all right, now we're having a negotiation. Let's move forward. Because you had the conversation in the language that they understood. There are people in the military establishment. Went to a fascinating presentation at DARPA a number of years ago, where the guy leading the conversation was really passionate about climate, but he said, here's what I want. I want to not be exposed to long supply line convoys, because that's the vulnerability in the field. I want a vehicle fleet that doesn't have a heat signature so the bad guys can't see it. And I would like the ability to launch heavy projectiles with microsecond gigawatt scale pulses. I can do that with an electric tank. I can do all those things. Now, it has some other climate benefits as well, but he spoke in language that the people he was listening to understood. And so as you go out and have this conversation, if you tell people that they have to choose between what's morally right and what matters to them, you're going to lose a lot of your audience. If, on the other hand, you figure out how to translate what you really want, don't sacrifice it all on your principles, but figure out how to frame it in terms that matter to them, you'll get a lot of people around, because making this transition is good for everybody, even if you don't really care about the environment. You just got to translate for them.
Can I add something to what Sean said? This applies at every level. So there's a community in my district, it's called Huntley, Illinois. It's right off of I-90. It's in McHenry County, one of the most conservative counties in my district. But the folks up in McHenry County are environmentalists. Okay, conservation is very important to them. Clean air and clean water is very important to them. The Huntley School District, District 158, just installed solar panels. Okay, and they're projected to save about $5 million as a result of these solar panels. And it's going to be part of their curriculum around clean energy solutions, and for K to 12, part of their science curriculum. Really important. It matches their values. It saves money. They're not talking about it as a climate change intervention. Y'all want to know things that you can do. There are a lot of interventions that can be made at the local level, but you have to speak in words that communicate the values that you share. The one thing, I've been reading the comments and people are talking about the Green New Deal. Here's what I want to tell you about the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal has already been defined for many people, and your opponents have already defined that. But the solutions that you're really excited about, you can characterize using language that speaks to shared values. And so, like Sean said, you can still get the outcome that you want in your advocacy, but literally the language that you use in your arguments matter. And I think that that's something that you might want to consider, particularly as you travel across the state in communities that people might not identify as Democrats or progressives.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want to follow up on that before we move on? Okay, perfect. This next question is actually for Mr. Gahris. You know, obviously we're talking a lot about climate change here as a really important subject, but I think that with your background, it'd be interesting to hear what are some of the you know, aspects of the environmental conversation that are often left out?
What's left out? Well, I think often people don't even have the conversation. When you in day-to-day conversation, it doesn't usually come up. And we have conversations of various kinds that I'm just trying to think of an example, but we don't always talk about climate change in day-to-day conversations with people on the street. Now, amongst ourselves, we talk about all kinds of things. If we get in our own silos, or information silo, we can talk all day, and then eventually environmentalists say we keep preaching to the choir and we're talking to each other. Then we get out on the street and we're not having those conversations at all. But people will talk about flooding or other issues. If you live in a coastal community, you might be talking about hurricanes and what those mean. Out here, what's happening to farmers, I think, matters to people. There are a lot of us in our movement, like in the Sierra Club, for instance, a lot of us are interested in being out in the outdoors, hiking and kayaking, bird watching, and we have these interests where we immerse ourselves in nature. But even then, we're not always talking about climate change. We're just enjoying nature. So it really depends on the context. Some things do get left out. I think we do tend to get into a box sometimes where we look at a certain point of view, and this is who we are, this is our self-identity, and we forget to listen to others who might have a different viewpoint. And when we lobby, we learn how to sit down with members of Congress or local officials and learn how to put forth our arguments. And so we do leave things out on purpose at that point because we're trying to find that common ground, like Representative Underwood was arguing that, yes, we need to find that common language. And sometimes that's hard to learn, you know, you see, but I do sense that every time I have a conversation, there is a sense of passion about something. It's just a matter of teasing that out in the conversation.
Right, absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and go for a question that was asked in the Q&A, which I thought was really, really interesting. You know, obviously during COVID-19, there's been a huge emphasis on listening to the scientists. Do you think that there is now an increased respect for science and expertise? And has that possibly affected the sort of political calculus, as it is phrased, of congressional Republicans or general opposition to climate action?
All right. Yeah, go for it, Sean.
Well, look, there's respect for scientists among the public, which I would submit was always there and always scored really well. And there's respect for scientists among the people who represent the public. And the fact is we have colleagues who got elected by interests who have been suppressing climate science for a long time. And they have no idea how to get elected if those interests don't continue to support them. And they also have no idea how to get elected if everybody has the right to vote. And so when you see a politician standing up and saying, you know what, we really need to minimize access to the voting ballot box, we need to oppose vote by mail. What that's code for is saying, I fundamentally trust American people to make the right decision, and that scares the bejesus out of me. So don't confuse support for scientists by Republican voters, by the American public, as support for scientists among people who are scared to death about whether the American public will hold them accountable. And I'm being a little bit strong about that because I've also seen some of the chat things popping up about bipartisanship. We got to sail into a really hard issue. We don't need to reduce CO2 to zero by 2050. We don't need to reduce CO2 to zero by 2030. We need to reduce CO2 by 1985. Because that's the last time that the environment was at historically stable levels of CO2, and we got to get way down. What is necessary vastly exceeds what is currently politically possible. And if we frame what we have to do by prioritizing bipartisanship, we are deciding to lose. We have to frame what we have to do by the science and then figure out how to force that into what is politically possible. And our colleagues across the aisle are not there yet in any significant number. The most honest conversation I had with one of my colleagues was, he said, I agree with what you're doing, but if I talk about climate change, it'll be like talking about gay marriage. I'll be replaced in the next election by somebody who's crazier than I am. And okay, I get it, but it ain't leadership. So we gotta set the bar much higher.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, Sean brings up, I think one of my favorite definitions of leadership is to disappoint your followers at a rate that they can tolerate. And that's what we're not seeing enough of on the other side of the aisle. It's, you know, it's important. But I also, the respect for science comes in waves and it disappears in waves. You know, over the course of my lifetime, there was a huge wave of respect for science during the Apollo program, the space race. All of a sudden, the scientists were great. And then later on in the 60s, oh, you know, what have they ever done for us? And then there was a wave of respect for scientists, or at least computer programmers, back in the 1990s when, you know, Bill Gates and all of these young entrepreneurs became heroes, I know, to my children as they were growing up. and then that sort of faded away. And then, you know, maybe there'll be another wave here, but we have to have a little more just continuous. We understand it's a long battle. You know, one of the things that we've won over the last 10 years, well, two things. The first things is the transition from incandescent lights to LEDs. This has been huge. You know, the total amount of electricity that we need in the state of Illinois and around the country is going down in large part because we've transitioned from incandescents to LEDs. That happened because of many, many decades of federally funded research and of scientists just working in their laboratories on this crazy project called getting a blue LED that works. And then all of a sudden, when a guy in a laboratory actually in Japan said, okay, I've got a blue LED, it works, the guy won the Nobel Prize and he deserves it. And if you fly over any city in the world today, it looks different than it did a decade ago because one person's scientific breakthrough. And we're seeing the same thing with electric cars. The only thing that makes those possible are the breakthroughs in batteries. And so actually, I don't know if people are aware of it, but in the Illinois 11th District and Argonne National Lab is where the cathode that is used in modern electric cars was invented. And so, you know, you can change the world with one good scientific idea.
I just want to add that, you know, in the United States Congress, we do two core things. We authorize new programs and fund those new programs, and then we conduct oversight over the presidential administration. In the Trump era, our largest wins for climate change has been in our oversight. Think about where we were at the very beginning of the Trump administration. You had an EPA administrator, Scott Pruitt, who, you know, wasted taxpayer dollars, who went through and systematically sidelined or fired all of the panels of scientists. They worked to get all of the climate change related research and information off of the federal website. And one of the things that I passed out of the House with unanimous support in the House, guys, is a provision that would prevent the Department of Agriculture from stripping climate change related research findings from their website. And while that might be a small advancement, it has huge impacts. Why? Because farmers all across this country are relying on reliable information, and you can't strip away research findings in an effort to change the public discourse around a key issue, right? And so while I understand that oversight is important but not sufficient to the movement and fight against climate change, I understand that, but we can't overlook it. And I think one of the keys around oversight in climate change is that there is a tremendous opportunity for bipartisan work. And while we still have a President Trump, we are going to need those Republicans to be willing to take up these investigations and pass the legislation to keep ourselves and our communities safe. And so I agree with Sean that bipartisanship cannot be the ceiling with which we work, right? We hope to be able to work together. We want to work together. And I think there's a lot of things that we can work together on, but recognizing the breadth of the role of the Congress, we will need to have some bipartisan engagement, I would say, bipartisan engagement on some of our oversight activities in order to be successful in blocking some of the things that the Trump administration has been doing.
Mr. Gahris, if you want to follow up with that.
Yes. Yeah, and this relates to bipartisanship. It actually, my main point, I think, would be about social media and other sources of information that people go to these days. And there's so much information out there, misinformation of the worst kinds. In particular, like the COVID virus, you can go online and somebody's sharing something, a meme that has a set of numbers associated with the efficacy of face masks. And you see these numbers, you have no idea where they come from. You go to Snopes.com, you look it up, and you find out it's a fake. And so there's all these fake memes going around. And this applies to climate change too. I think there's a systematic effort to fill our heads with misinformation. And we, as a public, aren't very good at sorting that out. We're not very wise about science. So I think the original question related to the trust in science. There's so much confusion out there that people have decided they can just have an opinion about science as opposed to understanding the scientific process. So we almost need to have some oversight. This is a challenge I'll throw to the members of Congress. What can we do about all the misinformation? It's even affecting the White House, as we noticed this week. I mean, it's tragic. I mean, somebody may have died by now drinking Clorox. So if you think about that, it's like, okay, we're dealing with some very, very big issues, and everybody's confused about what the facts are, and nobody understands the scientific process and how it works. So we get a challenge there. So I think when we message as activists or we talk to the public as an elected official, we got to be thinking about, well, let's sort through the facts. And I think there's some good examples of that. People in Springfield, for instance, and other state offices, the governors are doing a fabulous job explaining how the COVID virus is impacting our health and how we can deal with it, how it's affecting the economy, how you get your economies restarted again. All of these things that affect people's lives, we need to separate the wheat from the chaff and move forward in a logical way. But we also got to feel how people are scared and how you communicate to them, because when you're scared, you don't think straight, and then you pick up bad sources of information. So I think that the integrity of science, I think, is under attack, and Union of Concerned Scientists works on that issue very hard. How do we keep people moving forward with the right scientific basis, for their everyday discussions?
Can I just respond quickly to Jeff? There's Steny Hoyer, our majority leader, is a man of great wisdom, and one of the things he likes to say is that his favorite speech is a pile of 2-letter words. If it is to be, it is up to me. And every single one of you that has a social media account that has a share button on it, you are little media outlets. And what you decide to share influences, it goes viral, as they say. I mean, we're realizing today why we use that term, but these things go viral. And I think one of the things that we all have to be disciplined about, and I don't care where you are in the political spectrum, I don't care what your values are, when you see something on a social media site that fits all of your preconceived biases, and it gives you that little endorphin hop that makes you think, I want to share this, be skeptical, because that's the algorithms are designed to make you want to share that stuff and pop it up. And one of my, hands down, my favorite philosopher of science was Immanuel Kant, who introduced this whole idea of falsifiability, and his observation was that you fundamentally can't prove things are true. You can only try to prove them false and fail, because it only takes one black swan to disprove the thesis that all swans are white, right? It only takes one scientific experiment to prove that Newton's theory of gravity was not exactly right. And so if you are going to be a rigorous scientific thinker, whether you're trained scientifically or not, when you see something that conforms with what you want to be true, try to prove it false. Try really hard to prove it false. Really work at it. Do what a good scientist does, where you have a hypothesis and then you try to prove that hypothesis and try to prove it false. Because if you haven't done that and you've shared something that, okay, maybe it's not as egregious as drinking Clorox, but it fits your biases, because we're all little media creatures, that ends up being amplified into the void. I've been leading an effort to try to get the social media companies to change their practices and change their algorithms. I realize that's a long putt, but until we get there, if it is to be, it is up to me.
Absolutely. I think my physics teacher would be really, really happy to hear what you were saying about the scientific process. If anyone wants to follow up with that, we can do that, but there's also more questions, so.
I just want to say one thing, as a scientist here, there's a lot of this that is not purely scientific, because, the trade-offs that are necessary about how hard you're going to work, what fraction of your life you're going to spend trying to leave the planet better for your children. There's no unique scientific answer to how hard to work on that or all the many other problems. But one of the ways to come to a better answer is to spend a longer time thinking about one problem. Take this long shutdown and read a book. A book that I will recommend is a book called The Sand County Almanac. And this is a story, Jeff recognizes the book, Aldo Leopold. I probably read it twice from cover to cover. It's not very long by the time I got out of high school. And it's the story of a shack up in what are called the sand counties of Wisconsin, where the farmers came in and they cut down all the trees and they farmed for a few years and realized the topsoil was 2 inches thick. And when they destroyed the topsoil, the land was useless and they left. And this was the story of nature recovering that. Aldo Leopold went out in a little shack and then watched nature gradually cover the sins of mankind. And that it's not a scientific book, but it really, it makes you think about why you're put on earth and what you're really going to try to work on. And so there's a part of this that is not purely scientific. And that takes a while. You don't get that in a little endorphin rush. You get that by thinking deeply for hours, the sort of thoughts you get when you read a book from cover to cover. So, take advantage of this to just, get your head out of the cell phone and into a book.
I think one thing that would be really interesting for us all to sort of think about when it comes to the climate crisis and relevant to today, what do you guys see as the intersections between COVID-19 and the climate crisis? Congresswoman Underwood, you can start if you'd like.
Well, I mean, climate change is a public health emergency. COVID-19 is a public health emergency. And we have long talked about climate change from an economic lens, from a it's coming and it'll hurt you lens, but not teasing out the individual and really specific aspects that I think are really important to factor in. The difference is that climate change is not going to be solved with like these massive supplemental spending bills like we're doing with COVID right now. We need to have sustained investment over time and make a policy decision and sort of stick with it over time in order to reduce these emissions. And we haven't done that yet. And I would say that the solutions to both lie in our public health system that has been woefully underfunded for a very, very, very long time. And we need to really empower our state and county public health officials to do the work to protect our communities. So think about the healthcare impacts of climate change. We have extreme heat, extreme weather events, which have been increasing in frequency, hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis, which kill lots of people. We have the rise in vector-borne illnesses, so bugs, mosquitoes, birds. H1N1 started out in animals and came to humans. There might be some kind of link to a vector with COVID-19. We don't know yet. And then obviously emerging infectious diseases all have its roots in climate change. Or many, I will say, have their roots in climate change. So I think that, we have to have sustained investment in public health if we're going to be able to tackle pandemics like COVID-19 and be able to withstand the healthcare impacts of climate change.
Anyone else want to follow up on that?
Well, I think there's another lesson that we're in the process of learning is that there are some problems where the free market is the answer to them. But climate change is probably not one of them. Just the preparations that you make to defend your society, to get a good supply of masks, so when you get the pandemic, you have proper medical equipment on hand. Those are not money makers under normal circumstances. And that we have to understand that some things you say, just let all the different social media platforms compete. but and that works well, and the best ones generally win. But in other areas, we have to understand that it's a responsibility that's, really a worldwide responsibility to take action on these things, and to think separately about the problems where there's a social good to be provided by lowering the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere.
So I guess I'd say that, number one, we are seeing, I think, we're seeing with COVID in very rapid speed what we're seeing with climate in slower speed, which is that if you're driving down the wrong lane in the highway, a truck is coming and you don't swerve. When it hits, it exaggerates all of the inequities that already exist in our society. The people who are being most hit by COVID are the poorest, are minority communities, are people who already had, 50% of the country has less than $500 in their bank account. Those are the folks who are getting really hurt by this. If we do nothing on climate change, it's going to really stink to be a Bangladeshi. We're already seeing, mass migration and refugee problems from the poorest parts of the world. North Africa is essentially a climate crisis that we're seeing in real time. And oh, by the way, they're also really poorly prepared for COVID. Now, as against that, and I got to be a little bit careful in how I say this, because I don't entirely agree with what Congressman Foster just said. There are free market solutions to this. The problem is that we don't live in a free market. The IMF has calculated that the total direct and indirect subsidies to the fossil fuel industry in the United States are $650 billion a year. That's roughly equivalent to our entire defense budget. We're now sitting here in this COVID crisis. I mean, look, here we are talking about how do we get more money into workers' pockets? How do we defer student loans? How do we defer mortgage payments so that people don't have to spend as much money? And there's one industry going to Washington and saying, can you please raise my prices so that the American consumers will pay more? Give you 3 guesses what industry that is. It ain't the healthcare industry. It ain't the airline industry. It ain't the food industry. It's the oil industry. So what they're saying is, I fundamentally cannot compete in a free market. Please, whatever you do, do not expose me to a free market. Now, if we took those subsidies away, think about what happens, right? If you could actually get paid for the value you create to society, when you put a solar panel on your roof or when you insulate your home, what if you're a landlord who all the utilities are pass-throughs to your tenants? Why should you invest in efficiency? They're just paying for it. And yet it's a public good problem, right? And so if we actually had a free market in the energy space and we really committed ourselves to that, it would be a massive climate solution, and we would swerve the truck out of the wrong way on the highway, because as long as we sit where we are, we're gonna go and we're gonna smash into the truck. And I think there's probably a sloppy analog there to pandemic preparedness, because if we go through and we really invest in research and we develop all these drugs, as basic research always does, it's going to have a ton of unexpected benefits. We're going to have more people who want to come and study in the United States, and they're going to go do all sorts of other interesting things. So there's a lot of economic benefit that comes from being prepared beyond what we asked for. But when we're not prepared and we get hit, it hits the least amongst us much harder than it hits the most well-off among us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think now that we just have about 5 minutes left, we can go with just some closing statements. And if I could, as you guys discuss that, can you talk a little bit about what the best ways are for young people and high schoolers, college students to get involved in fighting this crisis, and any advice that you have for us to take action?
Okay, well, I think that there's a lot that you can do. I look at that example in Huntley as a great thing. Each of you are in school every day. What improvements can you make to your campus? How can you fight to make sure that they are incorporating clean and renewable energy sources? What is your personal consumption like? And how can you make small changes? And I know that we're all excited about bold change at the societal level, at the global level, and I get it. But we have to do both at the same time. And I think that there are tremendous opportunities in our local communities where you all can and have been leading and can be the inspirational change agents. Listen, we all have been inspired by Greta, but what if you were the Greta of your high school? Like, for real. Not like in a, oh, that's cute, haha, but for real. You all can make a huge difference. You know that there are shared values among your peers in this area. So if you mobilized your school and went to the school board and said, listen, this is what we need to see, and you've done all the research and you have some options, they will hear you out. Now, it might not be the exact solution that you want, but I mean, talk about being at the table and making some policy changes. You're right there. So don't think that you're dependent on other people making some decisions about your life, and that you have no agency. You have a lot of agency in your communities. And for those who are going to be 18 by November 3rd, y'all better go vote. And vote all the way down the ballot. Hello. So many people are like, oh my God, I don't know anything about county board. I don't know anything about these judges. I'm just going to stop. I don't know anything about these referenda. Guys, all of these things matter. And if you care about our planet and you care about our climate, you can hold elected officials accountable at every level of government for what their plan is to satisfy your objectives. And then once you do that, you have to go support them at the ballot box. Thanks so much for this event. Y'all did a great job. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Rep. Foster, perhaps you can go next.
Sure. Well, I think that's pretty much, what Lauren just said is it. Sean mentioned that the fossil fuel industry is going to be coming to us for a bailout. And when they come to the U.S. House of Representatives, they're not going to get it. And if they had come to us 2 years ago, they would have gotten it, because the three screens here, two of them are occupied by newly elected members, Sean and Lauren, who did not fund their campaigns from the fossil fuel industry and did not vote for them. Now, they won for many reasons, and they're great representatives for many reasons, but that was not a small part of it. And so, if they had not done what they decided to change their careers and take a huge risk on something that was uncertain to work. And because they are in Congress and not the people that they replaced, the fossil fuel is not going to get the bailout that it's going to demand. And that was because of the efforts of not only Sean and Lauren, but the thousands of volunteers that came out to make sure their voices were heard in the next election. So you never know. Every year we win or lose 1 or 2 elections by a handful of votes. They're members of Congress where there's an asterisk on their name for the first 3 weeks when they're counting every last ballot. And you never know when that's going to be your member of Congress who will have won or lost by a tiny number. So you got to participate because you never know when it's going to make a huge difference.
I feel like I'm just going to be amplifying what other people said, but fair enough. The vote, 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 not only to hold people accountable, but if you find yourself watching politics and watching what gets voted on and saying, boy, this is boring. They're talking about mortgage relief and Social Security and Medicare reform. That doesn't matter to me. You know why those things come up? Because old people vote like crazy. And if you want elected officials to really focus on and be educated and care and be thoughtful about the things that matter to you, then you got to vote, because then people pay attention to you. And what was really beautiful about the last election is we had a big increase in youth turnout, and all of a sudden things that matter to the youth, like climate change, like gun violence, like the opioid crisis, people are talking about that now because you elected people who cared about it because people voted. So it's not just accountability, but making sure that those issues that matter to you get into the zeitgeist. The other thing that I'd add, and this is building on what Congressman Foster said about really dive into stuff in detail and read a book. what I find is really hard about climate and energy policy is that there is a tremendous urgency with which we have to act if we are going to provide a stable planet for you guys and for your kids. But it's also really, really complicated. And when I was going and, 20 years ago, coming to DC and trying to advocate for green energy policies, what I heard far too frequently was that this problem is too complicated to move as quickly as you're telling me I need to move. And there's this tremendous energy that's come out of a lot of the youth movements on climate that have injected the urgency that has been long since missing. But there's a real danger if we go from saying this problem is too complicated to move quickly to this problem is too urgent to worry about complexity. We got to deal with both. And just to close where Lauren started, I think Greta is the example of how to do that well. She has, what your generation has is that you can say in a way that we can't, I am going to be on this planet longer than you are, you old farts. I have a moral authority that you don't have because I'm the one who's going to have to be cleaning up your messes. You can frame that argument and you can force that moral urgency in a way that is credible because of your age. But when they then said to Greta, so what should we do? She dropped the IPCC report and she said, read this. She didn't pretend to be an expert, right? Because there's a danger, I think, with some of the youth advocates who come to Capitol Hill who assume that because they got there with the urgency, they're now experts. And expertise comes with age, but you have the moral authority of youth. Use the strength you have, and then take the time to go read those books and get deep on these things because they are complicated. And we don't, maybe when the Kyoto Protocol was being negotiated, maybe we had enough time to do it wrong and then fix it. We don't have enough time to do it wrong right now. We certainly don't have enough time to do nothing. So model yourself after Greta, and thank you all for allowing us this opportunity.
Thank you. And I want to give Mr. Gahris a brief opportunity to finish us off, even though we are a couple minutes over time.
Great, thank you. Yeah, to echo some previous statements, but I think your first priority would be to talk about your values, talk about the urgency, why you care, and find out why other people are caring about their issues and how there's an intersection between their issues and your issues and why climate change has to be urgent. And I think that's a very important starting point, and to talk to other people. I think the passion is important, but don't forget that the older generations can still help you. I remember meeting Gina McCarthy, a former EPA administrator, who said, we old people have your back. We're going to be there fighting for you. We need to work together on this. So we need to make this multi-generational, and we need to be persistent with this. We have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. Very frequently, I would meet with local officials who said, in response to a suggestion that I was pushing, is that, well, we can't do that because here we do baby steps. And as Representative Casten was suggesting, we don't have time for baby steps. We need to do something big, bold, something that we have to think it through the complexity and make it work. And of course, we need the right people in Congress and local levels of government. So that means you have to get to know who these people are. Maybe you want to get involved with their campaigns, not just vote for them, but walk door to door this summer if they're passing out literature. And every campaign is going to be organizing soon and building a constituency that will help them move forward to their campaigns. It's kind of awkward now because we're in a virtual campaign mode, but sooner or later we'll be actually passing out literature or doing things on the phone. And I think just getting engaged and having conversations with people, even if it's over the internet, spreading the word and talking to people of different ages, and making sure, of course, that you vote. And we're even encouraging people to vote by mail. I think that's important too, because the seniors vote heavily, but they may not feel safe going to the polls this fall, but they have the option of voting by mail. And I think we need to remind people of that. Yeah, I think that's it. The bottom line is pursue your passions, try to learn, and as Representative Casten was suggesting, you don't have all the answers. I don't think anybody has all the answers, but we need to start having those conversations and work through it and find that there's local solutions as well as national and international. And if we just keep pushing and having conversations over time, we'll solve this problem. So thank you. It's been a pleasure being on this panel. I enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, appreciate it. Sorry we got a couple minutes over time, but I want to echo what everyone in the chat is saying, which is a huge thank you to all of you for taking some time out. It was truly a wonderful discussion. And I think that, you know, just like we'll get through COVID together, I think that we can conquer this one too. So have a great day, everybody. And thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.
You too. Stay well.